The ship came out of hyperspace near the third moon of Korvath. Captain Daniel Harris stood on the bridge and looked at the planet below. It was a beautiful world with green forests and blue oceans. But Daniel was not here to look at the view. He was here to save 3 human colony worlds from starvation. The Kovani Empire controlled this part of space. They had 17 star systems and more resources than they could ever use. Humans had only 5 small colonies, and they were running out of the rare minerals they needed to survive. Without help from the Kovani, millions of people would die within 10 years. Daniel turned to his second-in-command, Lieutenant Karen Brooks. She was a tall woman with short brown hair and sharp eyes. She had served with Daniel for 6 years and knew him better than anyone. "The Empress has agreed to see us," Karen said. "But I have to be honest with you, Dan. Everything I have read about the Kovani tells me they think we are nothing more than clever animals. They do not respect us." Daniel nodded slowly. He had read the same reports. The Kovani were an old species. They had been traveling between stars for thousands of years before humans learned to make fire. To them, humanity was like a child who had just learned to walk. "We do not need their respect," Daniel said. "We need their help. And we have to get it somehow." The third member of their small team walked onto the bridge. Dr. Samuel Grant was the ship's science officer and expert on alien life. He was an older man with gray hair and kind eyes behind his glasses. He carried a datapad in his hands. "I have been studying everything we know about the Kovani," Samuel said. "They value strength above all else. Their entire society is built on the idea that the strong rule the weak. They will not help us out of kindness. We need to offer them something they want." "What could we possibly offer them?" Karen asked. "They have better technology than us. They have more ships. They have more soldiers. What do humans have that they could want?" Samuel shook his head. "That is the problem. I cannot think of anything." Daniel looked out the window at the planet below. Somewhere down there was an Empress who held the fate of millions in her hands. He had to find a way to reach her. He had to find a way to make her see humans as something more than animals. "Get ready," Daniel said. "We go down in 1 hour." The shuttle landed in front of the Imperial Palace. It was the largest building Daniel had ever seen. The walls were made of a white stone that seemed to glow in the light of the twin suns. Guards stood at every door. They were tall creatures with silver skin, 4 arms, and large compound eyes like insects. Daniel, Karen, and Samuel walked up the long steps to the main entrance. Kovani nobles watched them pass. Daniel could hear them making clicking sounds with their mouths. He knew enough about their language to understand they were laughing. "They think this is funny," Karen whispered. "They think we are wasting their time." "Let them laugh," Daniel said quietly. "We are not here to entertain them. We are here to negotiate." The throne room was even bigger than the outside suggested. The ceiling was so high that Daniel could barely see it. Hundreds of Kovani nobles stood along the walls, all watching the 3 humans walk down the long, red carpet toward the throne. And on that throne sat Empress Valitha. She was larger than the other Kovani, nearly 3 meters tall. Her silver skin was darker than her subjects, almost gray. She wore a crown of black metal on her head, and her 4 arms were folded across her chest. Her compound eyes fixed on Daniel like he was a small bug she was thinking about stepping on. "So," Valitha said, her voice deep and cold, "these are the humans who requested an audience with me. I must admit, I was curious. Your species has only been in space for 200 years. Most young races are too afraid to even look at the Kovani Empire. But here you are, asking for help." Daniel bowed his head slightly. "Thank you for seeing us, Your Majesty. We are grateful for your time." "Grateful," Valitha repeated. She made that clicking sound that Daniel now knew was laughter. "How sweet," How very human. She leaned forward on her throne. Tell me, Captain Harris, why should I care about your little colonies? Why should the Corvani Empire lift one finger to help a species that has nothing to offer us? Daniel had prepared for this question. He had spent months thinking about what to say. But now, standing before this ancient and powerful creature, all his prepared speeches seemed weak and foolish. We offer partnership, Daniel said. Long-term friendship between our peoples. Humans may be young, but we learn quickly. In time, we could become valuable allies. Velitha stared at him for a long moment. Then she laughed again, louder this time. The nobles around the room joined in. The sound filled the throne room like the buzzing of 1,000 angry insects. Friendship, Velitha said when the laughter died down. The human offers friendship. How charming. She stood up from her throne and walked down the steps toward Daniel. Each of her footsteps echoed in the huge room. She stopped just 2 meters away from him. Up close, she was even more frightening. Her compound eyes reflected dozens of tiny images of Daniel's face. Her mouth was filled with small, sharp teeth. Let me tell you something about friendship, little human, Velitha said quietly. In my experience, friendship is just a word weak creatures use when they want something from the strong. The Corvani Empire does not need friends. We need servants. We need resources. We need entertainment. She paused, and something changed in her eyes. A new light appeared there, something that looked almost like amusement. But perhaps, Velitha continued, we could come to an arrangement. A sporting arrangement. Would you like to hear my offer, Captain Harris? Daniel felt Karen tense beside him. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to be careful. But he had come too far to turn back now. I am listening, Your Majesty, he said. Velitha smiled, showing all of her sharp teeth. On my personal world of Corvath Prime, there is a creature, she said. The natives called it the Shadow Maw before we killed them all. It is the most dangerous predator in this sector of space. It has killed every hunter who has ever tried to capture it. 200 of my own soldiers have died trying to tame it. She began to walk in a slow circle around Daniel, like a predator examining its prey. Here is my offer, Velitha said. Tame the Shadow Maw, and you can have my entire planet. Not just mining rights, not just trade agreements. The entire world will become a human colony with everything on it. Daniel heard Samuel gasp behind him. Karen grabbed his arm tightly. And if I fail? Daniel asked. Then you die, and your people go home with nothing. You have 1 month. 1 human may enter the hunting grounds. No weapons. No technology except basic survival gear. Velitha stopped in front of him and looked down at his face. Do you accept, little human? The room was completely silent. Every Corvani was watching. Daniel knew what they expected. They expected him to refuse. They expected him to beg for easier terms. They expected him to act like the weak, frightened creature they believed all humans to be. Daniel thought about the 3 colony worlds depending on him. He thought about the millions of people who would die if he failed. He thought about everything humanity had overcome in its long history on Earth. And then he thought about wolves. I accept, Daniel said, and then he smiled. Empress Velitha's eyes widened slightly. She had expected fear. She had expected desperation. She had not expected a smile. You are either very brave or very stupid, Velitha said. Maybe both, Daniel replied. When do I start? Velitha laughed again, but this time there was something different in the sound. Something that might have been the smallest bit of respect. Tomorrow morning, she said. Rest well tonight, Captain Harris. It will be your last peaceful sleep. She turned and walked back to her throne, her forearms swinging at her sides. The audience was overdawed as Daniel walked out of the throne room with Karen and Samuel. He could feel the eyes of every Corvani following him. They still thought he was going to die. They still thought this was nothing but entertainment. They had no idea what they had just agreed to. "Daniel," Karen whispered urgently as they left the palace. "What were you thinking? No one has ever survived against that creature. You cannot fight it without weapons." Daniel looked at her and smiled again. "I do not plan to fight it," he said. "I plan to make friends with it." Karen stared at him like he had lost his mind. Samuel just shook his head slowly. "Tell me, Sam," Daniel said as they walked toward their shuttle. "What do you know about wolves?" "Wolves?" Samuel frowned. "The Earth predators? They went extinct centuries ago, but we have good records about them. Why? Because 10,000 years ago, humans did something impossible," Daniel said. "They took the most dangerous predator in their world and turned it into their best friend. They called them dogs." He looked back at the palace one more time. "If our ancestors could do it with wolves, I can do it with a shadow maw." Karen and Samuel exchanged worried looks. But somewhere deep down, they both felt something else. Something that felt almost like hope. Tomorrow, Daniel would walk into the jungle alone. Tomorrow, he would face a creature that had killed 200 trained soldiers. Tomorrow, he would try to do the impossible. But he was human. And humans had been doing the impossible since the beginning of time. 2 weeks had passed since Daniel entered the jungle. His clothes were torn and dirty. His face was covered with insect bites. He had lost weight from eating only what the forest provided. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that Shadow now slept at the edge of his camp every night. Daniel woke up one morning to find the creature lying just 3 meters away. Her scales were a calm shade of gray-blue, which Daniel had learned meant she was relaxed. Her great head rested on her paws, and her glowing eyes were half closed. "Good morning," Daniel said softly. Shadow opened one eye and looked at him. She made a low rumbling sound in her throat. It was not a growl. It was something else. Something almost like a greeting. Daniel smiled. He reached into his pack and pulled out the last of his dried meat from Earth. He had been saving it for a special moment. This felt like that moment. "I have something for you," he said. He held up the meat so Shadow could see it. The last piece. "I want you to have it." He placed the meat on the ground between them. Not close to himself. Not close to Shadow. Right in the middle. Shadow raised her head and sniffed the air. Then, slowly she stood up. She walked toward the meat with careful steps. Her eyes never left Daniel's face. She stopped at the meat and looked at Daniel again. Then she did something she had never done before. She picked up the meat in her mouth and carried it closer to Daniel. She dropped it at his feet. Then she lay down next to it and waited. Daniel's heart nearly stopped. He understood what she was doing. She was not taking the gift for herself. She was sharing it with him. She was treating him like a member of her pack. With shaking hands, Daniel picked up the meat. He tore it in half and offered one piece to Shadow. She took it gently from his hand, her massive jaws closing around the meat without touching his fingers. They ate together in silence. When they were finished, Shadow made that rumbling sound again and pressed her nose against Daniel's shoulder. Daniel carefully reached out and touched her scales. They were warm and smooth, like polished stone. Shadow did not pull away. She leaned into his touch. "We are friends now," Daniel whispered. "I promise I will never hurt you. I promise I will always protect you." Shadow closed her eyes and let out a long, slow breath. Over the next few days, Shadow introduced Daniel to the rest of her pack. There was a male named Stone, almost as large as Shadow herself. There were 2 younger adults, a female Daniel called Mist and a male he called Ember, and there were 3 young ones, barely bigger than large dogs. The young ones were afraid of Daniel at first. They hid behind their parents and made small, scared sounds. But Shadow walked up to Daniel and pressed her nose against his hand. She was showing them that he was safe. One by one, the young ones came closer. They sniffed Daniel's feet and his legs. One of them, the bravest, stood up on its back legs and put its paws on Daniel's chest to smell his face. Daniel laughed and gently scratched the young one behind its ears. "Hello there, little one. Are you not the brave one?" The young shadow mole made a happy chirping sound, and its scales turned a bright shade of green. Daniel guessed that green meant happiness. "I think I will call you Scout," Daniel said. Scout chirped again and ran back to its siblings, its small tail wagging like an excited puppy. Daniel looked at Shadow, who was watching the whole scene with her glowing eyes. "Thank you," Daniel said. "Thank you for trusting me with your family." Shadow made that rumbling sound again. Daniel was starting to think of it as her way of saying, "You are welcome." On the observation platform, the atmosphere had changed completely. At first, the Corvani had watched Daniel's progress with amusement. They expected him to die at any moment. They made bets on which day would be his last. But now, 2 weeks in, Daniel was still alive. More than alive. He was thriving. And he was doing something that no Corvani had ever done. He was building a relationship with the deadliest creature on the planet. Empress Valitha watched the screens without speaking. Her advisors stood around her, waiting for her to say something. But she just watched. On the screen, Daniel was playing with the young shadow moss. He threw a stick and Scout ran after it, bringing it back with obvious pride. The other young ones joined in, turning the game into a competition. "This is impossible," said one of the Corvani generals. "He must be using some kind of technology, some chemical that affects the creature's minds." "Our scanners show nothing," said another advisor. "No technology, no chemicals, just one human and his strange behavior." Valitha finally spoke. Her voice was quiet and thoughtful. "It is not strange behavior. It is different behavior. Different from what we have always done." She turned to look at her advisors. "We always approached the Shadow Maw as warriors. We tried to defeat it, to dominate it. We never considered simply being peaceful toward it." "Because that is weak," said the general. "The strong do not make friends with their prey." Valitha turned back to the screen. Daniel was sitting with Shadow now, scratching that spot behind her ears that she seemed to love. The massive predator looked almost peaceful. "Perhaps," Valitha said slowly, "there is more than one kind of strength." Back in the jungle, Daniel was learning things about the Shadow Maw that no one had ever known. They were highly intelligent. They could solve problems, remember things, and communicate with each other using sounds and color changes. They hunted as a team, working together to bring down larger prey. They cared for their young with obvious love and attention. They were not monsters. They were a species complex and fascinating. A species that had been defending itself against Corvani attacks for decades. "No wonder you killed so many of them," Daniel said to Shadow one evening. "They were trying to hurt your family. You were just protecting the ones you love." Shadow looked at him with her glowing eyes. She seemed to understand, even if she could not understand the words. Daniel also learned that the Shadow Maw had a long memory. Shadow showed him places where Corvani hunters had attacked her pack. She showed him the spot where her mother had died fighting off a group of soldiers. She showed him a cave where she had hidden her young ones during the worst attacks. Each place had a story. Each story was filled with pain and loss. "I am sorry," Daniel said at each spot. "I am so sorry for what they did to you." Shadow pressed her nose against his hand each time. It seemed like her way of accepting his apology, even though he had done nothing wrong. On the 20th day, something special happened. Daniel was walking through the forest with Shadow beside him. The rest of the pack followed at a distance. They had accepted Daniel now, but Shadow was still the only one who stayed close to him. They came to a clearing where a large animal lay dead on the ground. Shadow had hunted it earlier that morning. It was more food than the pack could eat in one day. Shadow walked to the dead animal and looked back at Daniel. Then she used her teeth to tear off a piece of meat and carry it to him. She dropped it at his feet. Daniel understood. She was sharing her hunt with him. Among pack animals, this was one of the greatest signs of trust and acceptance. Tears formed in Daniel's eyes as he picked up the meat. "Thank you, Shadow. I am honored." He ate the raw meat right there. It was tough and bloody, but he did not care. This was not about the food. This was about what it meant. Shadow watched him eat, her scales glowing a soft shade of green. When he finished, she walked up to him and pressed her forehead against his chest. Daniel wrapped his arms around her massive neck and held her close. "We are pack now," he whispered. "You and me, family." Shadow made that rumbling sound, louder than ever before. Far above, on the observation platform, Karen was crying. Samuel had to take off his glasses to wipe his eyes. Even some of the Corvani were watching with strange expressions on their faces. Empress Valitha stood perfectly still, her compound eyes fixed on the screen. "Family," she repeated softly to herself. He called the creature family. She had offered this challenge as entertainment, a way to humiliate the humans and remind them of their place in the galaxy. She had never imagined that a single human could do what her own warriors could not. She had never imagined that the answer was so simple. God, do not fight. Do not dominate. Do not conquer. Just be kind. Be patient. Be present. And in time, even the most dangerous creature in the universe might become your friend. Daniel still had 10 days left in the jungle, but he had already won something more valuable than a planet. He had proven that humans were not just clever animals. They were something else entirely, something the Corvani had never seen before. They were a species that could look at a monster and see a friend, waiting to be made. And that changed everything. The morning came too quickly. Daniel stood at the edge of the jungle and looked at the wall of trees in front of him. The leaves were dark green, almost black. The air was hot and wet. Strange sounds came from deep inside the forest, calls and cries of creatures he had never seen. Corvath Prime was a world of eternal twilight. 2 suns hung in the sky, one red and one orange. They cast long shadows across everything and made the whole world look like it was on fire. It was beautiful in a dangerous way. Karen stood beside Daniel, her face tight with worry. "You still have time to change your mind," she said. "We can find another way." Daniel shook his head. "There is no other way. The Empress made that clear. If I do not do this, millions of people die." He put his hand on her shoulder. "Trust me, Karen. I know what I am doing." "Do you?" Karen asked. "Because from where I am standing, it looks like you are about to walk into a jungle full of monsters with nothing but a water bottle and some dried meat." Daniel laughed softly. "That is exactly what I am doing. And it is exactly what our ancestors did 10,000 years ago. They walked into the wilderness with almost nothing and came back with the first dogs." Samuel walked up to them with a datapad. He had spent all night studying every piece of information about the Shadowmaw that he could find. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. "I found something interesting," Samuel said. "The natives of this world, before the Corvani killed them, they lived alongside the Shadowmaw for thousands of years. They never tried to hunt it. They left food for it near their villages. They treated it like a god." "A god?" Daniel asked. "Or at least something holy," Samuel said. The Corvani thought this was superstitious nonsense. They believed the natives were just too weak to kill the creature. But I think the natives understood something the Corvani do not. Daniel nodded slowly. They understood that some creatures should not be fought. They should be respected. "Exactly," Samuel said. He handed Daniel a small bag. "I prepared this for you. It contains strips of dried meat from Earth. Real meat, not the synthetic stuff we usually eat. If the shadow maw is anything like Earth predators, the smell might interest it. Daniel took the bag and put it in his pack. Thank you, Sam, for everything. Samuel shook his hand firmly. Come back alive, Daniel. The galaxy needs more humans like you. The observation platform was built on a hill about 1 kilometer from the jungle. Empress Valitha was there with her court, watching on large screens. Daniel knew they expected this to be quick. They expected him to die within the first few days, probably the first few hours. He was going to prove them wrong. Time to go, Daniel said. Karen hugged him tightly. Be careful, she whispered. And if you see that creature, run. Do not try to be a hero. Running is the worst thing I could do, Daniel replied. Predators chase things that run. I am going to do the opposite. I am going to show it that I am not afraid. He stepped away from his friends and walked toward the jungle. With each step, the wall of trees grew larger. With each step, the sounds of the forest grew louder. With each step, his heart beat faster. But he did not stop. He did not turn back. He walked into the darkness between the trees, and the jungle swallowed him whole. The first 3 days were about survival. Daniel found water sources and marked them on his mental map. He found plants that looked safe to eat and tested them carefully. He built a small shelter from fallen branches and large leaves. Most importantly, he watched. He watched every creature that moved through the forest. He learned their patterns, their sounds, their behaviors. A good hunter knows the land, but Daniel was not trying to be a hunter. He was trying to be something else entirely. He was trying to be a neighbor. On the second day, he found the first sign of the shadow maw. Deep scratches on a tree trunk, made by claws the size of his fingers. The marks were fresh. The creature had been here within the last few hours. Daniel did not run. He did not hide. Instead, he sat down near the marked tree and ate some of his food. He stayed there for an hour, just being present. Then he left a small piece of dried meat at the base of the tree and moved on. On the third day, he found footprints. They were huge, almost as wide as his chest. The creature that made them must be enormous, at least 3 meters long. The prints showed 4 legs with thick pads and sharp claws. Daniel followed the tracks for a while, then stopped. He did not want to seem like he was hunting the creature. He sat down again, ate some food, and left another piece of meat near the tracks. On the 4th night, he saw it. Daniel was sitting by a small fire he had built. The flames were low, just enough to keep the insects away. He was eating the last of his rations for the day when he felt something watching him. He looked up slowly and saw 2 glowing eyes in the darkness. The shadow maw stepped into the edge of the firelight. It was the most terrifying thing Daniel had ever seen. The creature was as big as a large horse, but built like a wolf. Its body was covered in dark scales that seemed to shift color as it moved. Its mouth was full of teeth, designed for crushing bone. Its forelegs were thick with muscle, and its claws dug deep into the ground with each step. But it was the eyes that caught Daniel's attention. They glowed with a soft blue light, and there was intelligence in them. Real intelligence. This was not a mindless beast. This was a thinking creature. Daniel forced himself to stay calm. His heart was pounding so hard, he could hear it in his ears. Every instinct screamed at him to run. But he knew that running would mean death. Instead, he slowly lowered his eyes. He had read that many predators saw direct eye contact as a challenge. He did not want to challenge this creature. He wanted to show respect. "Hello," Daniel said softly. His voice shook slightly, but he kept talking. "I am not here to hurt you. I am just passing through your territory. I apologize for the intrusion." The shadow maw tilted its head. It seemed confused by his behavior. Daniel guessed that every other creature it had met had either attacked it or run away. No one had ever just sat there and talked to it. Slowly, carefully, Daniel reached into his pack and pulled out a strip of dried meat. He held it up so the creature could see it, then placed it on the ground in front of him. "A gift," Daniel said. "For you." The shadow maw did not move for a long moment. It just watched Daniel with those glowing eyes. Then, slowly, it began to circle around him. Daniel stayed still. He kept his eyes down and his body relaxed. The creature sniffed the air. It was smelling the meat, but also smelling Daniel. Learning his scent. Deciding if he was a threat. After what felt like hours, the shadow maw stopped circling. It approached the piece of meat and sniffed it carefully. Then, in one quick motion, it ate the meat and turned away. It walked back into the darkness without attacking. Without making any aggressive moves at all, Daniel let out a long breath. His whole body was shaking. "Step 1, he whispered to himself. Introduction. Over the next week, Daniel repeated this process many times. He would find a place to rest, build a small fire, and wait. Sometimes the shadow maw came. Sometimes it did not. But every time it appeared, Daniel acted the same way. He stayed calm. He offered food. He spoke in soft, gentle tones. The creature was learning that Daniel was not a threat. It was learning that Daniel was different from the Corvani, hunters who had tried to kill it for so many years. But Daniel was learning too. He was learning the creature's body language. The way its scales changed color depending on its mood. The way it moved its head when it was curious. The way it growled low in its throat when it was uncomfortable. He began to understand that the shadow maw was not just one creature. It was the leader of a small pack, a family. Daniel saw the other members sometimes, watching from the shadows. 2 adults and 3 younger ones. They were scared of Daniel, but their leader seemed to be teaching them that he was safe. "You are not a monster at all," Daniel said one night as the shadow maw sat on the edge of his camp. "You are just a creature trying to protect your family, just like any human would do." The shadow maw made a soft sound in its throat, almost like a response. Daniel smiled. "I am going to call you Shadow. Is that okay?" Shadow tilted its head and blinked its glowing eyes. "I will take that as a yes," Daniel said. Back on the observation platform. Karen and Samuel watched the video feeds with growing amazement. "He is actually doing it," Karen breathed. "He is actually making contact with that thing." Samuel nodded slowly. The Corvani could never understand what they were seeing. They saw a monster that needed to be killed. Daniel sees a creature that needs to be understood. Empress Valitha was watching too. Her expression was impossible to read, but she had not looked away from the screens in hours. "Interesting," she said quietly. "Most interesting." In the jungle below, Daniel and Shadow sat together in the firelight. They were not friends yet. Trust like that took time. But they were no longer strangers. They were beginning to understand each other. And that was the first step towards something that would change everything. The 28th day arrived with the twin suns rising through the thick jungle canopy. Daniel stood at his camp one last time and looked around. This place had been his home for almost a month. He had learned every tree, every stream, every hidden path. But more importantly, this was where he had found a family. Shadow stood beside him, her scales glowing a calm blue. The rest of the pack waited nearby. Stone, Mist, Ember, and the 3 young ones, including Scout, who was now Daniel's constant shadow. They had all accepted him. They had all learned to trust him. "It is time to go back," Daniel said softly. "Time to show them what we have done." Shadow made that rumbling sound in her throat. She understood, even if she did not know the words. She had watched Daniel look toward the direction of the observation platform many times over the past weeks. She knew something important was waiting out there. Daniel began to walk toward the edge of the jungle. Shadow walked beside him. The others followed. At the observation platform, a crowd had gathered. Word had spread throughout the Corvani Empire that a human had survived 28 days in the Shadowmaw territory. Ships had come from 3 different star systems to witness what happened next. Empress Velitha sat on a portable throne at the front of the platform. Her face was impossible to read. Her advisors stood around her, whispering nervously to each other. Karen and Samuel stood at the edge of the platform, their eyes fixed on the jungle. Karen had barely slept in days. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Daniel being torn apart by those massive jaws. But the video feeds had shown something different. Something impossible. Something wonderful. "There," Samuel said suddenly, pointing toward the trees. Daniel emerged from the jungle. He was thin and dirty, his clothes reduced to rags. He looked like he had been through a war, but he was not alone. Shadow walked beside him, her massive head level with his shoulder. Her scales were a calm gray-blue, showing no sign of aggression. Behind her came the rest of the pack. 5 adult Shadowmaws and 3 young ones, all following Daniel like he was their leader. The crowd went completely silent. Daniel walked up the slope toward the observation platform. Shadow stayed at his side. The other Shadowmaws spread out behind them, their glowing eyes scanning the crowd of Corvani. The guards raised their weapons, but Velitha raised one of her 4 arms. "No one moves," she commanded. "No one fires." Daniel stopped about 10 meters from the platform. Shadow stopped beside him. She was so close that Daniel could feel the heat from her body. "I have done what you asked," Daniel said. His voice was tired but strong. "The Shadowmaw has been tamed. She and her pack will not harm anyone who does not threaten them." Velitha stood up slowly. She walked down from the platform, ignoring the worried sounds from her guards. She stopped just a few meters from Daniel and Shadow. Shadow growled softly. Her scales shifted to a darker color. "Easy," Daniel said, putting his hand on her neck. "She's not a threat." Shadow's scales slowly returned to their calm gray-blue. She stopped growling, but her eyes never left Velitha. The Empress looked at the massive predator, then at the human standing beside her. Her compound eyes studied them both for a long moment. 200 of my soldiers died trying to do what you have done," Velitha said quietly. 17 of my best warriors. All of them armed, all of them trained, all of them failed." She turned to face the crowd behind her. "And this human, this creature we thought was nothing more than a clever animal, walked into that jungle with nothing but food and water. He had no weapons, no technology, no plan except to be peaceful." Her voice grew louder, and he succeeded. He tamed the untamable. He befriended the unbefriendable. He did what the entire Corvani Empire could not do in 50 years of trying. She turned back to Daniel. "How?" she asked simply. "How did you do it?" Daniel looked at Shadow, who was watching him with her glowing eyes. He reached up and scratched that spot behind her ears that she loved so much. "I did not try to defeat her," Daniel said. "I did not try to dominate her. I did not approach her as an enemy to be conquered." He turned to face the crowd. 10,000 years ago, on my home world, my ancestors faced creatures much like Shadow, wolves. They were the most dangerous predators on our planet. They hunted in packs. They were fast and strong and smart. Many humans wanted to kill them all. He paused. But some of my ancestors tried something different. They did not see the wolves as enemies. They saw them as potential partners. They shared food with them. They showed them kindness. They built trust slowly over many years. Daniel smiled. Those wolves became dogs. They became humanity's best friends. They helped us hunt. They protected our homes. They kept us warm on cold nights. Without them, humans might never have survived. He looked directly at Velitha. That is what humans do, Your Majesty. We make friends. We build connections. We find common ground with creatures that everyone else sees as monsters. It is not about being strong or weak. It is about understanding that every creature, no matter how dangerous, wants the same things: safety, food, family, love. The observation platform was silent. The Corvani nobles stared at Daniel with their compound eyes. No one moved. No one spoke. Finally, Velitha spoke. "You have won the challenge," she said. "By the terms of our agreement, Corvath Prime now belongs to humanity." A murmur ran through the crowd. This was an entire planet, rich with resources and strategic value. The Corvani had never given away anything so valuable, but Daniel shook his head. "I do not want your planet," he said. Velitha's eyes widened slightly. "You refuse the prize?" "I refuse to take something that will create resentment and anger," Daniel said. "The Corvani would never forgive humanity for taking one of your worlds. It would plant the seeds of war that might grow for generations." He stepped forward. "What I want is much more valuable than a single planet. I want partnership. I want trade agreements and mutual defense pacts. I want humans and Corvani to work together, not as masters and servants, but as equals, as allies." He looked back at Shadow. "I want what I have with her: trust, respect, friendship." Velitha was quiet for a long moment. Her advisors whispered nervously behind her, but she ignored them. "You are asking for something the Corvani have never given to any species," she said slowly. "You are asking us to treat you as equals." "I am asking you to see us clearly," Daniel replied. "Not as clever animals, not as weak creatures who stumbled upon technology, but as a species that has something to offer, something valuable, something that even the mighty Corvani Empire lacks." "And what is that?" Velitha asked. Daniel smiled. "The ability to turn enemies into friends." Karen and Samuel watched from the platform with tears in their eyes. They had seen Daniel do impossible things over the past month. But this might be the most impossible thing of all. He was not just winning a negotiation. He was changing the way an entire empire thought about humanity. Velitha stood in silence for what felt like hours. The entire crowd held its breath. Finally, she spoke. "The Corvani Empire has existed for 10,000 years, she said. "In all that time, we have never met a species quite like yours. You are weak. You are young. You have no great fleet, no ancient knowledge, no powerful weapons." She paused. "But you have something we do not. You have the ability to see possibilities where we see only problems. You have the courage to extend a hand of friendship to creatures that could kill you with a single blow. You have hope." She extended one of her 4 arms toward Daniel. "I accept your proposal, Captain Harris. Let us begin a new chapter in the history of our peoples. Not as conquerors and conquered, but as partners, as friends." Daniel reached out and took her arm in both of his hands. "Thank you, Your Majesty. You will not regret this." Behind him, Shadow made that rumbling sound of approval. Her scales glowed a warm shade of green. The crowd of Corvani nobles did not know how to react. Some looked angry, some looked confused, but a few, just a few, looked thoughtful. They looked like they were seeing humans for the first time. Karen ran down from the platform and threw her arms around Daniel. She was crying openly now. "You did it," she whispered. "You actually did it. We did it," Daniel replied. "All of humanity did it. I just reminded them who we really are." Samuel joined them, his old face split by a huge smile. "History will remember this day," he said. "The day a human changed the galaxy without firing a single shot." Daniel looked down at Shadow, who was pressing her nose against his leg. "I had had help," he said. The news spread across the galaxy like wildfire. A human had tamed the Shadow Maw. A human had earned the respect of the Corvani Empire. A human had turned potential enemies into potential allies. Other species began to take notice. For years, They had dismissed humanity as an unimportant young race. Now they were reconsidering. If humans could do this, what else might they be capable of? On distant worlds, in alien governments and corporate boardrooms and military headquarters, beings of all shapes and sizes began asking the same question. Who are these humans really? And, for the first time, they started to find out the answer. Humans were not the strongest species in the galaxy. They were not the oldest or the wisest or the most technologically advanced, but they might just be the most important, because humans knew something that other species had forgotten: that the greatest victories do not come from war. They come from connection. 1 year had passed since Daniel walked out of the jungle with Shadow at his side. In that time, the galaxy had changed in ways no one could have predicted. The Tree of Corvath, as the media called it, had opened doors that had been closed for centuries. Human ships now traveled freely through Corvani space. Trade routes carried goods and ideas between two civilizations that had once been strangers. Scientists from both species worked together on research projects that neither could have accomplished alone. But the changes went far beyond the Corvani Empire. Other alien civilizations had watched what happened on Corvath Prime. They had seen a single human do what armies could not. They had heard Daniel's words about friendship and partnership and connection. And slowly, one by one, they began to reach out. The Venth Collective, a group of 3-star systems known for keeping to themselves, sent a diplomatic mission to Earth. They had been fighting a war with a neighboring species for 200 years. Both sides were exhausted, but neither knew how to stop fighting. They asked if humans could help. Daniel was sent as the lead negotiator. Within 6 months, he had helped both sides find common ground. The war ended, and a new peace began. Not through force or threats, but through patient listening and creative problem-solving. The Syndicate raiders, who had terrorized human colonies for decades, were harder to reach. They did not want peace. They wanted profit. But even they began to change after a few human traders showed them that honest business could be more profitable than piracy. Within a year, the raids had stopped almost completely. On world after world, in system after system, humans were proving something important. They were not just one more species competing for resources and power. They were something new, something different. They were bridge builders, peacemakers, friends. Daniel Harris became famous throughout the galaxy. Ships were named after him. Statues were raised in his honor. Young humans grew up hearing stories about the man who tamed the untamable. But Daniel did not spend much time enjoying his fame. He spent most of his time on Corvath Prime, working on a project that was very close to his heart. The Shadow Mall Conservation Center was built on the edge of the jungle where Daniel had first met Shadow. It was a place where humans and Corvani worked together to study and protect the most misunderstood creatures on the planet. Daniel walked through the main building early one morning. The halls were quiet at this hour. Most of the staff were still asleep. But Daniel liked being here when it was peaceful. It gave him time to think. He stepped outside and found Shadow waiting for him. She was older now, her scales slightly duller than they had been a year ago. But her eyes still glowed with that familiar intelligence. And she still made that rumbling sound of greeting when she saw Daniel. "Good morning, old friend," Daniel said, scratching behind her ears. Shadow pressed her nose against his chest, then turned and walked toward the jungle. Daniel followed, as he always did. They walked together through the trees, following paths that only they knew. The rest of the pack was scattered throughout the forest, but they were never far. Sometimes Scout would appear and trot alongside them for a while before running off to chase something. Interesting. Daniel had learned more about the Shadow Mall in the past year than anyone had learned in 50 years of trying to hunt them. He had discovered that they had a complex language of sounds and color changes. He had mapped their family structures and social rules. He had even learned how they chose their leaders. Shadow was the leader of her pack because she was the wisest, not because she was the strongest. The pack had chosen her through a process that looked remarkably like an election. They had watched all the candidates for months, judged their decisions, and then gathered together to make their choice. "You are more like us than anyone knew," Daniel said as they walked. "You have families and communities and politics. You have friends and enemies and complicated relationships. You are not monsters at all. You are just different." Shadow made a soft sound that might have been agreement. They came to a clearing on top of a small hill. From here, Daniel could see the twin suns rising over the jungle. The sky was painted in shades of orange and red and gold. It was the most beautiful view on the planet. Daniel sat down on a fallen log, and Shadow lay down beside him. Her great head rested on her paws, and her eyes half closed as she enjoyed the warmth of the morning sun. "I have been thinking about home lately," Daniel said quietly. "About Earth, about all the species we learned to live with there. Dogs and cats and horses and birds. We changed them, but they changed us too. They made us better. They taught us how to care for something other than ourselves." Shadow opened one eye and looked at him. "I wonder what will happen now," Daniel continued. "Now that we have met other intelligent species. Now that we have friends among the stars. Maybe we will keep doing what we have always done. Maybe we will keep reaching out, keep making connections, keep building bridges." He smiled. "Maybe that is what humans are for. Not to conquer the galaxy, but to bring it together. To help different species understand each other. To turn enemies into friends." Shadow made that rumbling sound again. It sounded almost like she was saying yes. Karen found Daniel still sitting on the hill an hour later. She had come to the conservation center for a meeting, but she had taken a detour when she heard Daniel was here. "The Empress wants to see you," Karen said, sitting down on the log beside him. "She is hosting a gathering of species from across the sector. She wants you to speak." Daniel sighed. "Another speech. I am starting to run out of things to say." Karen laughed. "I doubt that." She reached over and patted Shadow on the head. The Shadow Maw had grown used to Karen over the past year and tolerated her presence, though she clearly preferred Daniel. "Do you remember what you said to me before you went into that jungle?" Karen asked. "You said you were going to make friends with the Shadow Maw. I thought you had lost your mind." "You might have been right," Daniel said. "No," Karen said firmly. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You knew that humans have something special, something that sets us apart from every other species in the galaxy." "And what is that?" Karen smiled. "Hope. You never gave up hoping that you could reach Shadow. You never stopped believing that friendship was possible. And because you believed it, you made it real." Daniel looked at Shadow, who had fallen asleep in the warm sunlight. Her scales were glowing a soft, peaceful green. "I learned that from her," he said. "She could have killed me 100 times. But she gave me a chance. She let me prove that I was not a threat. She taught me that trust goes both ways." He stood up and stretched his tired muscles. "All right," he said. "Let us go see what the Empress wants." The gathering was held in the Imperial Palace, in the same throne room where Daniel had first met Velitha. But the room looked different now. Instead of one throne surrounded by Corvani nobles, there were dozens of seats arranged in a circle. Representatives from 20 different species sat together, talking and arguing and laughing. Daniel walked to the center of the circle. All eyes turned to him. "Thank you for inviting me," he said. "I am honored to be here." Empress Velitha nodded from her seat. She looked different, too. Less proud, less cold. A year of working with humans had changed her in ways she was still discovering. "A year ago," Daniel began, "I walked into a jungle to face a creature that had killed hundreds of trained soldiers. Everyone expected me to die. Everyone thought the challenge was impossible. He paused. But I had something those soldiers did not have. I had a different way of seeing the world. I did not see an enemy to be defeated. I saw a potential friend waiting to be discovered. He looked around the circle at all the different faces watching him. Humans are a young species. We have only been in space for 200 years. We do not have the oldest technology or the strongest military or the largest empire. But we have something that is perhaps more valuable than all of those things. We have the ability to hope, to believe that things can be better than they are, to see possibilities where others see only problems, to reach out to creatures that are different from us and find common ground. Daniel smiled. That is what I did with Shadow. That is what humans have been doing for 10,000 years. And that is what I hope we can keep doing, together, for the next 10,000 years. He extended his hand toward the circle of representatives, not as conquerors or servants, not as strangers or enemies, but as partners, as friends, as family. One by one, the representatives stood. One by one, they reached out to take Daniel's hand. Kolvani and Venth and a dozen other species, all standing together in a circle of unity that had seemed impossible just a year ago. Empress Velitha was the last to stand. She walked to Daniel and took his hand in her own. A year ago, I offered you my planet as a joke, she said quietly. I never believed you would succeed. I thought I was humiliating you. And now? Daniel asked. Velitha looked around the circle at all the different species standing together. Now I understand that you gave me something far more valuable than I could ever have given you. It gave me hope. You showed me that even old enemies can become friends, that even an ancient empire can change. She squeezed his hand. Thank you, Daniel Harris. Thank you for showing us what humanity truly is. Daniel squeezed back.